Barbados. Every time I do kind of artist talks like this, I actually like to situate where Barbados is geographically, because that's maybe the number one question that I do get asked is where exactly is Barbados? So as a Barbadian Canadian artist living within the Caribbean diaspora, my practice is deeply rooted in queer, migratory, and trans-regional narratives. A region that was heavily colonized, the Caribbean became an extremely homophobic territory because of Christian values inherited from colonizers. My practice is interested in complicating these linear, straight dialogues to make space for queer constructions of time, place, and territory. With the rise of fascism growing more present globally, I can't help but acknowledge the collective feelings of grief and anxiety that we all experience while expressing the importance of queer placemaking as survival. Particularly, I'm thinking of queer immigrant communities who embody self-empowerment found within the construction of queer spaces and time outside of linear capitalist time. The work behind you is also in front of you now. But during the Now Never residency at Access Gallery, it was my goal to emphasize this queering of time through a photographic body of work. By complicating how we consider standard image making using various sources of collected imagery, from internet archives, personal archives, my own photographs, which are then processed through multiple lenses. This included rephotographing, reprinting, scanning, 3D scanning, and the use of mirrors as another form of a lens to disrupt or open up existing imagery. The practice of sourcing imagery from varied networks of media has always been foundational in my practice. Hi. Using my own photographs and appropriating images from film, contemporary art, and pop culture, I see this as a way of reflecting the complex and entangled networks of the Caribbean diaspora. Again, a region so heavily affected by colonization, the Caribbean is a melting pot of peoples and cultures and networks and connections. In my practice of using and appropriating images, a form of deconstruction typically occurs, physically and conceptually, as I make demands of an image to question itself. For the work during this residency, a physical form of deconstruction was taken on with the scaling, fragmenting, rephotographing, and reprinting of images that were physically installed in the gallery space. This deconstruction, I kind of link to the Caribbean sort of fragmented histories which have been and continue to be cut and severed and shipped and exported by colonial powers. And what of queer Caribbean histories? As a queer youth in the Caribbean, I felt even more severed from any kind of tangible guideline or sense of belonging, which is a feeling shared by all of my queer, trans, and non-binary Barbadian kin. What I'm interested in is the ways in which my queer Caribbean family uses this cut and this fragmentation as a way to rupture linear modes of being, arriving at places of queer making, and in my case, arriving there through imagery and representation. It's kind of hard to see, but maybe I'll describe this image that is from my MFA thesis work that I completed earlier this year. But it's essentially an image made using a flatbed scanner. And the little baggie contains an image of an island from a pop cultural source with my urine inside of the bag. And then that lays on top of the scanner, or on top of the glass. And then I place this sort of ceramic cherub behind it. So my thesis work during my MFA was questioning what this could look like for queer Caribbean people. What archives can us queers create for ourselves when so much has been lost? And for us Caribbean queers, what spaces might emerge through reclaiming that stereotypical, idyllic Caribbean imagery and asking that imagery to do queer work? How can we reflect on these questions to imagine new experiences of queer spatiality and temporality to disrupt capitalist timeframes? As a collector and gatherer of images, my laptop is a digital garbage dump of screenshots and JPEGs, pirated and stolen from the films I watch, the pop culture content that I consume, and the border crossings articles that I save and pretend that I'll read one day. Always in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, how can we imagine new sites or archives of potential queer futurism? And so for my MFA thesis work, I arrived at the solution of using my own bodily fluids in tandem with images. This was a way to use a queer body as an active archive to disrupt, fragment, destroy images. I became quite interested in the way that islands are typically depicted in film and pop culture. We have like the deserted island, the paradise, the villain's hideout, the undiscovered land waiting to be conquered, the retreat. Imagery of islands is predominantly associated with isolation, death, mythology, or as a territory of escape from visitors in the north. So my process was that I would acquire these tiny little baggies, I would print out my collection of islands, place each image in a tiny bag, take those bags to the bathroom, unzip my pants, and piss in each baggie. I would then take my samples to a scanner, lay them out on the surface, and capture the image of each island contained in my urine. It was a way for me to reclaim and filter these images through my body as my warm piss slowly absorbed into the inkjet prints, creating new imagined queer territories. Again, an attempt at reclaiming that false, idyllic Caribbean imagery. So the formal qualities of the image reminded me of Arthur Jafa's work, particularly his binder notebook works, where Jaffa spent decades collecting images to consider the scale of Black lives in America, presenting them in these collages contained in cellophane sheets, almost like a survey that works to deconstruct the collected images themselves, presenting them to viewers to make us question what is being represented. And so I was thinking a lot about, bodily fluids and piss, and the way that urine kind of marks a territory or creates a new territory. We can think about the ways that dogs mark their territory by peeing. I think a lot too about like cis men in the bathrooms and the urinals wagging their cocks so that they can feel like they exist in this space that's designated as being a man, right? So further to this, I was looking at how other artists marked new territories with urine. I was thinking a lot about David Hammond's pissing in the corner of a giant Richard Serra sculpture in New York and being approached by a cop to present identification. Hammond's performance to me is a direct recreation of his own territory on an established white artist's monumental artful stature of the time. It's also Hammond's making us, the viewer, aware of the ways in which his body as a Black man in America is constantly surveilled and policed. Andy Warhol created paintings through oxidization with urine, which resulted in these almost map-like territories. Andres Serrano famously drowns Christ in a vessel of piss. I was also very inspired by my friend and contemporary Christopher Lacroix, who, for his MFA thesis work, would read aloud from his diary as he consumed large quantities of water to the point of voiding himself, to douse the metaphorical faggot alight beneath him, and then capturing his image. Piss becomes a way of queer placemaking and marking territory or space for other bodies. And so when I started this residency at Access Gallery, post-MFA, I was still thinking a lot about bodily fluids, but not necessarily wanting to work with biohazardous materials in this space, out of respect of my fellow residence cohort members. But I had been thinking a lot about queer territories and queer placemaking specific to Vancouver, because for me, Vancouver has been very formative in my journey as a queer person. I started thinking a lot about Michael Morris and Vincent Trassoff, two conceptual artists from the 60s and 70s in Vancouver, and their work around sort of like a piss archive, for lack of a better term. And then naturally, looking at their work, it led me back to their Babyland project. So Babyland was a project that I always admired, but had never made the connection in my brain of how this very specific queer Vancouver moment in our history had a lot to do with the kinds of work that I'm interested in as well. In 1972, Michael Morris and Vincent Trassoff purchased a plot of land in Roberts Creek on the Sunshine Coast and created an artist retreat known as Babyland. Quoting curator Scott Watson, for 2 summers in particular in 1972 and 1973, Babyland became the set for improvised and planned performances involving props and people that were filmed and photographed. Light On, which is a still from that work, Light On, was a performance usually involving 2 naked people who would draw on each other with the light reflected by a hand mirror that they were holding. Babyland was a very specific kind of queer placemaking right here in BC, where Morris and Trassoff created a utopic wonderland where artists literally removed themselves from capitalist society to go live and fuck and make art in the forest. A contradiction to the traditional retreat one would expect of heading into the forest to get away from the city. And this intentional reclamation of the retreat is what really interests me as someone who is from the Caribbean, a region which is so heavily mystified by the global north as a tropical playland or a retreat. So the kind of work that the artists did at Babyland was never work with the interests of capital gain, but of artistic labor. And whether that was painting hundreds of wooden blocks for site-specific ephemeral paintings that would exist in unison in the water of the lake for only a moment to then be swept away forever, only leaving the memory of what was, a trace of it. So these are kind of some examples of slides from the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Gallery's archive of Michael Morris and Vincent Trassoff. You can see some of their image bar research here, where artists were hand painting these wooden blocks, and then they would take them to specific sites in Babyland, place them in the land, do performances with them, take photographs. It's important to emphasize that Babyland was in fact a counter-dialogue to the idea of the retreat. This was not some kind of West Coast hippie bullshit stand-in for activism, but a literal removal of artists from traditional society. And also not just an insertion of artists into nature dialogue, but a complete deconstruction and fragmentation of those two things, so that there was no distinction between art and nature, one or the other. Quoting French writer Adrienne Laroche, at Babyland there was no electricity, no central heating, no running water. For Morris and Trassoff, however, Babyland was a parody of the countercultural retreat, far from the pressures of the straight urbanity of city life. The visitors hoped to cultivate an avant-garde community spirit and to experience, in the countryside, a partly homosexual desire through various works. So here artists would create performances with light and mirrors in their bodies, using the materiality of a temporal space to create ephemeral works that were never tangible or sought to be tangible. It needed to exist outside of a structured system of objects and capital. And yes, we have the documentation and the archives, which I'm very thankful for. But I guess that's kind of my point, is that queers are in charge of creating their own archives and determining what is important to us for our survival. Queer histories are ephemeral. what can be considered tangible or factual in straight time does not work for us. We can understand queer evidence as being ephemeral. It fragments the framework of traditionally understood or fixed evidence, something that's like factual, like recalling a memory or conjuring a possibility. Ephemera and the imaginary intertwine. In one of my favorite quotes from the late writer Jose Esteban Munoz, he proposes queerness as a possibility, a sense of self-knowing, a mode of sociality and relationality. Queerness is often transmitted covertly. Instead of being clearly available as visible evidence, queerness has instead existed as fleeting moments that are meant to be interacted with by those in its epistemological sphere, while evaporating at the touch of those who would eliminate queer possibility. So it was my hope that by working with the fleeting moments and ephemeral queer evidence that was created at Babyland through the image archive that we have today, that I could position these images in a way to make them confront themselves, to use mirrors similarly to Robert Smithson and the artists at Babyland as a tool to create a void or a displacement from the image. And hopefully it is through this void or this reflection that the image opens up and allows us to imagine other possibilities. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll open it up to questions for the next 15 minutes. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, kid.
It's beautiful. I love seeing these images on the screen again.
Thank you.
You can open it up to like compliments too.
Or if you think the work is shit, rip it apart. Hi, man.
I wonder if you could seem to have a little more time talking about the way that fragmentation impacts physically work.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of what feels like aggregate kind of completely awful, like there's reduction and like duplication, like there's a lot of kinds of strategies that you use to aid fragmentation.
Yeah.
And then I also just like in terms of material.
Yeah.
But then I also wondered just about these pop culture references to the small islands.
Yeah.
Because at first when you started talking about the heat, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then as you started to explain how you come to heat being this kind of like extension of queerness, and like that was really good to hear and important to hear, so thank you for sharing that. But like, what are these little tiny pop culture, like what is it that we're pissing on, and what, like is it a much larger kind of like a political or ecological kind of statement to the Caribbean, because that itself is so complicated.
Totally.
And like how do you position yourself in that kind of statement?
Totally. Okay, so
So
maybe.
those are very separate questions.
Yeah, no.
Can I just, because like what you said, I'm like, yes, now I know how to explain. And so like, yeah, are you pissing on pop culture?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it queering it? Like there's like a bit of, you kind of have two things going on where you're queering it through your body, but then also the, like pissing on something as a statement.
Yes.
Like how are you engaging that and how do you use your images?
Totally.
And then everything else that I said.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So maybe like the first part of that question, the sort of physical fragmentation that occurred was I was sourcing these images digitally, and some of them are my own photographs as well. And then I kind of like thought through, okay, scale-wise with the space that I'm working with, how big do I want them? I would take them into Photoshop and then digitally like crop and fragment into sort of multiple frames, and then print them out as inkjet prints. Bring them to the space and install them on the walls, using a table as a corner, and then also bringing, like, introducing the mirror to like further complicate how we're seeing what's going on. And then there was a moment, especially in the center one, there's an image there of my body and some shadows of directly to the right, there's some more like frames of images that appear to be behind or next to that. Those were actually like propped up on a piece of wooden plank that I like stuck them to so that they were like physically leaning against the wall behind the mirror. So there was a lot of complications going on, and I wanted to feel like I was making it complicated in order to sort of have that visual deconstruction happen. And then the question about the P is really good. Yeah, the pop culture, for me, it's like growing up in the Caribbean, images that you see of places that we call home have always been in Disney cartoons or Popeye cartoons or King Kong or Jurassic Park, where like there's people on helicopters like flying into the island where the monsters are, kind of thing. Also inspired by, I'm very inspired by like islands in Greek mythology as well. I'm thinking about how quote unquote heroes in Greek mythology always travel to an island in order to extract or kill something as like a labor that needs to be sought out. So peeing on it is in a way a critique of these sort of pop cultural references or representations of islands, but it's also kind of like a fun, queer, kinky thing. Like pee doesn't necessarily have to be like a disrespectful thing in those kinds of vernaculars, but it's a way of like, yes, disrespecting the image a little bit and reframing it, but then like having fun with it as well. Yeah, that's your question.
To expand on this when you were kind of talking about mirrors and just looking at the pieces, and specifically within the very center one, how you say that you are in this piece. I'm curious about if you could expand on what the mirror sees and what the mirror doesn't see. Because within the centerpiece, the mirror, how I'm viewing it, the mirror doesn't see you. But it does. I mean, it's very, very abstract in the way that I see that shadowy figure as some sort of monster. But then within the other pieces, there are certain things that the mirror picks up, but certain things the mirror doesn't pick up. As well as just like certain colors as well.
Totally. So maybe just for clarity, in the center image, that silhouette figure is not me. That's an image taken from the Morris Trasov archive. The image that is me is kind of like the chest nipple image. That is an inkjet print that's actually like physically laying on top of the mirror, so that's not a reflection. It's like on the surface. And then sort of like better examples in the rightmost one. There's like very tiny images of my friend Jonathan's legs who are here, and other sort of like marble sculptures that I just been photographing. And those existed like physically at a distance in the space in those tiny little hand mirrors. Does that answer the spatiality sort of question? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's to like come to that metaphorically though.
Yeah.
What is that conversation of like what the mirror sees and doesn't?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like thinking about again like seeing the mirror as a void. I mean, I always refer back to Robert Gibson. He's like, I don't know, a douchey dead artist, but I love his work a lot, and the way that he was using mirrors in his like Yucatan series, where he would like just install the mirrors in the land, photograph that, and it becomes a sort of like cut in the land. And so it's sort of like you're cutting into the actual thing while also opening back up onto the possibilities of what's in front of or behind that. Is kind of how I see the mirror as well. In that things could also exist within what's behind the reflection. interactions going on.
I think what I'm getting at that is the things that are on the surface as well, on the surface being
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to have those like physical prints, not always as reflections, but to have them be on the mirror as well. So the mirror is removing something while also the image is removing the mirror.
Can you talk a little bit about like how the skin technology is making these images? Because when you mentioned thinking about your archives, thinking about like when it becomes visible and also like the dangers of that
Mm-hmm.
becoming visible and that your evidence is when sort of used in order to punish people or in order to like bring the queerness to light in a very dangerous way.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that like the scanner has this very, very bright light that is like flattening things and making them incredibly visible.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really tool in that.
Yeah, and scanners can be very like cold because they do their job is to archive something as true to its original form, but the scan is never the original image. It's kind of its like own artifact as well. So it's almost to again like referring back to this idea of like queer people trying to create archives for ourselves. Yeah.
Keith has like a real intention with the scanner too, like the idea of there being like a liquid that's sitting on top of this.
Yeah, and well, so this work in particular, I actually had the horrible experience of having all of the paint leak onto this scanner in the creation of this image, and I was working at the institution that I got my MFA from, using their equipment in the tech room. So there was a lot of anxiety around creating these images. You can kind of see there's a little, my mouse isn't working, but there's a little peak right here where you can see the liquid is starting to come out of the surface of the bag. And yeah, the plastic, the cellophane, I think relates back to this idea of preserving or archiving something as well. Trying to contain the queerness, but the queerness doesn't want to be contained in the example of this image. It like spills out.
With your setup, the blue line, I know your work before you use like line chords and stuff. Is there any specific reason to the curation?
Like the color?
Well, the color and the tape and
Absolutely.
the setup.
So I was thinking as well conceptually about architecture. I was working with corners and this idea of using the corner as a form of queer space as well. Like corners are typically, we think of them as spaces or territories of punishment, like people stand in the corner. So like a space that feels kind of separate from existing spaces and lives within the same space. And then I wanted to, with the installations, refer back to that not only in like the content of the images, but the final installation by creating almost this like diagrammatic corner as well. And then the choice of the blue tape and this sort of like chroma blue coloring, and thinking about like film editing as well and like the possibilities of what can be. And I typically would normally use like the green screen, but there's a really famous Canadian artist who's representing Venice in 2026, and I'm inspired by their work a lot, and they're having a big moment right now, and they use green screens a lot, so I kind of like wanted to have this moment where I could distinguish myself. from that artist who I really admire a lot.